I think it's a bad thing when death has no consequence.
Death as a career move in comics is a very good one.
I think we have cheapened death in comics down to the point of uselessness. It has no impact anymore.
Like the mythological heroes of ancient times, comic book characters seem to walk the line between mortal and immortal. They're simple adventure characters, but at the same time, they can symbolize so much more.
Well, in a way, superheroes are demigods. They're Christ-like in the sense that they do live in this zone between humanity and God. They're sort of intermediaries between this divine, unknowable presence that some people imagine exists and the human world. And so, like Christ, when they die, they are very human in their death, but they also hold out the potential, because they're connected to the divine, of an afterlife.
Death is a part of life, and you're dying to analyze it as much as possible.
In my own book, I think everybody in Hellboy and in the BPRD has been dead at least once. So what I always say about my own stuff is, when characters die, they just become more interesting.
Comic book heroes lead some of the most dangerous lives ever seen in fiction. So it goes without saying there's always the threat of death. And not just for the heroes, but also for everyone around them.
When we started the strip, I wanted Gwen Stacy to be the girl that Peter would end up marrying.
We were told that they would like to shake up the readers. So I said, if you really want to shake them up, kill off a major character.
When I read The Death of Gwen Stacy as a very young boy, I was like blown away, because I was like, no, that doesn't happen. What, Spider-Man's supposed to save her.
You know, our decision's made purely on story. Then what kind of stories can I tell afterwards? What kind of, you know, what will that death mean to the other characters? You know, Gwen Stacy was Peter's girlfriend, and Green Goblin killed her.
It becomes apparent when there's a huge reaction to the death of a girl that this guy had to go, because the fans would not have accepted that he slips away and you don't see him again for 3 or 4 months. I still maintain that half the things we did were without our choice, because the characters almost wrote their own history. A character that's well-formed, put in a certain circumstance, is going to react a certain way. You have no choice. That character has to react right, otherwise you lose the validity. And that's what happened. We painted ourselves into a corner, and we had to kill the Goblin.
One of the best examples of a hero sacrificing everything to protect the world around him is the meeting between Superman and Doomsday, a confrontation that led to the death of the most famous hero in comic books, a fictional death that shocked the real world.
Traditionally, whenever we would get stuck at a meeting, somebody would holler out, "Let's just kill him."
Superman was killed by Doomsday, who is this absolute force of nature, who has virtually no backstory when we first encounter him. He's just pure evil, absolute pure evil. Their battle existed on a very highly symbolic level.
What happened next became one of the strongest sequences ever in the Superman stories. The death of Superman story itself, between him and Doomsday, isn't a story to me. It's a setup for the story. The story is, what would the world be like without Superman? And oddly, the real world reacted even crazier than the characters in the comic book world.
I think it was something that society lamented. They weren't necessarily with Superman at that point when he died, but they sure missed him when he was gone. And it made the media, and it was such a big, big event.
The day that that comic came out where Superman died in 1992, literally nothing else in the world was happening. Nothing. And so Superman's death suddenly became headline news around the world.
We panicked when the world got so into it, and they took possession of Superman and were outraged. How dare we do this? We don't have the right to kill Superman and take him away. And the sad truth is, Warner Brothers and DC Comics do have the right, because it's their character.
The problem there is that now you've played your ace. You know, that's your big play. And once we brought Superman back from the dead 6 months later, which we all knew as faithful comic readers we were going to do anyway, that's put a permanent wedge in the door between here and the afterlife.
In a sense, it's like the people weren't behind the ideas that he symbolized, but when they were gone, it became absolutely profound, and they needed them back desperately. And that's what lent so much emotional weight to the return of Superman.
Superman has died before, most famously in an imaginary story by Superman's creator, Jerry Siegel. In 1961, Superman number 149, Lex Luthor, murders the last son of Krypton with kryptonite, leaving Supergirl to carry on as the Man of Steel's replacement. Captain America has been seen as a symbol of the United States since his creation in the 1940s. He stands for truth and justice. And at a time when America needed heroes and symbols to look up to, Captain America was murdered.
The way the Red Skull pulled it off is rather complicated. It's kind of a Manchurian Candidate kind of a take on it. But I always knew that the person behind it had to be the Red Skull. I remember when the death of Superman happened and I ripped one of the bags open and read the book and I was like, Lex Luthor doesn't kill him? It just didn't make any sense. Like, how can you have Superman die and Lex Luthor's not responsible? So I just knew it had to have, you know, Captain America-centric kind of interest in it. I think people had seen it at Marvel, a few people had seen it and thought, oh, this is really cool. And then at some point, Jeff Loeb saw it.
I'm like, what? And they were like, yeah, I mean, that's what happens after the war. Everyone had been so focused on Civil War that they didn't really embrace this notion that we were going to be the biggest story since the death of Superman. That the death of Captain America during the Iraqi war was going to be news.
It was a courageous thing to do, and it also gave the feeling that there's some reality to this, that this isn't just silly stuff. I mean, my gosh, one of the people could die.
We did a panel in Seattle right after his death. A woman stood up and said, who are the soldiers in Iraq supposed to look up to now that you've killed Captain America? Totally serious.
When I got like an email from vets, you know, or from soldiers in Iraq, it was kind of weird. It was like, wow, you know, I wrote it back and I said, well, just keep reading the book, guys. You know, it's still about Captain America. But it was just like, you know, Captain America is not a real person actually fighting anything, right? Like, it's a comic book. But to people who look at that as the symbol, to them, you just took something away from them.
Death in superhero comics can range beyond the loss of a single life. There are events where hundreds of billions of people are simply wiped out. DC's universe had become too confusing and needed to be simplified. The best way to do this was to eliminate entire galaxies of people. Proof that there is something more powerful than any superhero. The editor.
I hated Crisis when it came out, and it still makes my head hurt a little bit.
I think that there was something very useful about killing off parts of the DC universe at that point. It had gotten very complicated. It was very inaccessible to new readers.
Comics, in terms of serialization, are completely unparalleled. We don't have any stories that go on as long as they do. And I think the unique problems that come out of that continuity were addressed in this tremendous climactic moment with the Crisis on Infinite Earths.
There were multiple versions of Superman because there was an Earth 1 and an Earth 2, which was the original Superman, but why it was Earth 2, I don't know, since he came first. Then there was an Earth 3, and there were all these other Earths, and there were all these different characters.
Crisis was a way of sort of sweeping everything away and resetting the stage, saying that we're starting the DC universe as a universe, fresh.
We also wanted to get rid of a lot of double characters. In the case of Supergirl, we wanted Superman to be the sole survivor of Krypton. We also killed the Flash, the issue after we killed Supergirl. It was to simplify the DC universe, to rebuild the DC universe, and it's the reason I did it.
It was something that we'd never seen in art before. And I think how they resolved it was incredibly unique and very creative.
Not all comic books are about spandex-wearing superheroes. Sometimes there are characters and stories that feel almost too real. Not all comic book characters can easily walk back and forth between life and death. And not all creators find it so easy to end a character's life.
It is not easy to kill a comic book character. You have so much invested in them, the reader's invested. So it's not something you do lightly, it's not something you do for effect. You become attached to these characters as if they were a pen pal or a phone friend. You may not have ever actually shook their hand, but the communication on an internal level is just as strong as it could be with the person that you've always talked to on the phone. So you don't want to lose them. You begin to value the character.
People are always drawn to human elements in stories, and whenever you can relate to a character in a story, it becomes effective. And I think it was an area of the comic book market that wasn't being attacked, and I think he saw that and decided to put more real-life stories and real-life issues into this comic book so that people could really relate to his comic.
When I started the series, the first thing I took on was AIDS. I wanted to show the story of the impact on people, not statistics, not advice. I just wanted to show the toll that it takes on people. That I didn't feel like there was enough of those stories out there. And the first thing we began addressing was, here's a character with AIDS, and they're not going to make it. And what is that like for everybody that loves that character? It is very strange to write their demise. When I did do that in my series, I really focused on the fact that, well, these things happen. There's no way around it. And there is a good way and a bad way to deal with it. And it's not the end. Dying is not the worst thing that can happen to you.
Jaime Hernandez is one half of the writing team that produces the comic book Love and Rockets, a very grounded book about love and relationships. His story, The Death of Speedy, illustrates a death in comics that is very real and very human.
When I did The Death of Speedy, all I knew at first was I wanted to kill someone. I knew it wouldn't matter to anyone if it was somebody I made up fresh for that story, because you wouldn't care about him because you didn't know the person. It had to be someone that you knew. And sorry, Speedy was the victim. You know, I go, you're dying, guy. You know, what, why me? You know, I was like, sorry, man, you're elected.
The characters participate in certain gang activities. And the greatest thing that I can liken this to is Romeo and Juliet, which is fundamentally, when it starts, it's a comedy. You have all these characters who are youthful. It's a story of hormones. It's a story of having fun. And the gangs are just sort of a way of life. And then Mercutio dies. And all of a sudden, Shakespeare's probably most famous play goes from becoming a comedy to becoming an absolute tragedy. This is exactly what happens with the death of Speedy.
This is a key character that one feels strongly about. A lot of the feelings one has mostly come through the other characters in the story. And it's a death that happens completely off-panel. One doesn't see him die. It is not a dramatic death, but it is the effect of this death and the build-up to it with the story itself, titled The Death of Speedy Ortiz, something one knows is coming from the beginning and then does not end up seeing. Ends up being one of the most powerful stories of that generation of comics.
I think the only thing I had in the Speedy, besides that I knew he was going to die, was that I wanted to do the very ending where he comes back as a ghost. That happened to someone close to me. One day they woke up and their boyfriend was telling them in the middle of the night, saying, "Don't worry, everything's gonna be okay." And the next day she heard he died in an auto accident.
Beautiful ending. It's just the sense of haunting, the sense of that he's gone, but his spirit still has some sort of place in this world, which of course it does. The death of Speedy haunts Love and Rockets for the rest of the series' first run. It's something that weighs heavily on their mind, very similar to the death of Gwen Stacy in Spider-Man. It affects the world.
Strange Adventure number 205 ushered in the arrival of a very special hero to the DC universe, Deadman. Former circus acrobat Boston Brand dies in the first issue and spends his afterlife trying to find out the identity of his killer. There is one man that comic book superheroes fear more than anyone else, Jim Starlin. From the universe-ending forces behind Crisis on Infinite Earths to the more grounded and realistic Death of Speedy, comic books have dealt with death in many forms. Here's some essential reading on death in comics. This is Comics 101. The Crow is a supernatural story about a young couple in love who both meet their tragic end through gang violence. Written and drawn by James O'Barr, The Crow is a very moving story about love, death, and revenge. Fallen Sun is Jeff Loeb's 5-issue follow-up to The Death of Captain America, and it stars some of the biggest heroes in Marvel Comics. Each book is representative of one of the 5 stages of grief, giving the death of Cap more depth and meaning. Neil Gaiman's Death, the Time of Your Life, is a story about love, relationships, sacrifice, and death. Death being personified by an attractive teenage goth girl. There is one man who can make even the most powerful hero quiver.
Hello, I'm Jim Starlin, and I specialize in wet work involving superheroes.
Jim Starlin is kind of your go-to guy if you want to kill a mainstream superhero comics character. He ended the Warlock serial that he did by killing off Warlock. A few years later, he did the first big Marvel graphic novel, which was The Death of Captain Marvel. Shortly thereafter, he was the writer who was involved in killing the second Robin.
Well, when I took over writing Batman, the first thing that occurred to me that if you were going to go out and fight crime, it might be a good idea to bring along a small child that you can dress up in primary colors and have them shoot at him instead of you. So the whole idea of Robin never sat well with me. Then Denny O'Neil came up with this idea of the call-in on a voting thing.
And the gimmick was this. The Joker gets hold of Robin to Jason Todd, and there's an explosion, and did Robin survive or did he not? If you dial one number, the kid survived. If you dial the other number, the kid didn't survive.
My feeling was he was going to die right from the beginning, because I know what my fan base is like. They're a bunch of little ghouls. And it was almost a statistical tie. I think there was only about 70 votes separating him living and dying.
We were accused of staging a Roman circus and killing a kid, and I kept wanting to say, you do realize this is paper and ink you're talking about, not a carbon-based life form.
And suddenly the merchandising department realized that they had all these lunch boxes and pajamas and all these things with Robin on it. And so suddenly the whole idea was Jim's idea. And that was pretty well the end of my time working up there for a while.
Though Jim Starlin has had a long career in comics and has brought many a character to their end, there is one story he wrote that changed comic books and made people see these heroes in a different light.
Captain Marvel died of cancer. The reason that happened, and I had been planning all these other endings for that particular story, such as the bombs and the bullets and that. But my own father passed away from cancer, and this was sort of my way of working through therapy on it. Instead of paying a shrink, I got paid by Marvel to write a story about it instead.
The thing that was always sad to me in comics was when somebody killed a character well and then somebody else brought him back. If you kill him really well, I'd kind of like to see him stay gone, because nothing to me is better than a great ending. And you know, Jim Starlin killed Captain Marvel with cancer, and it was beautiful. And I said, man, keep him dead. It was such a beautiful wrap up to the character.
He deserved to die fighting, and he didn't. He died from something that kills so many of us every single year, that it really brought a lot of humanity to comics. And it also, at the same time, spoke to people who were dealing with cancer, who who wanted to go past it, but it's something that you can't fight. It's something that you can't defeat, and that even this tremendous superhero couldn't beat it. I mean, his strength was not sufficient enough. He didn't have the right tools. I think a lot of people really felt resonance with that.
I could see that obviously Starlin had been through something with someone dying himself, because it was too real. The idea of Captain Marvel going through a death by cancer was ridiculous, but at the same time there was true emotion in it, because I think Starlin was actually talking about something that happened to him, you could tell. So yeah, I mean, I was in two minds of that. I thought it was a terrible superhero story, but a great story. She just had written about his dad or his granddad, whoever it was that had affected him in that way.
It sold so well for Marvel that nobody could actually get down on us for what we were doing. Some of the other editors who were up there started finding out what we had done, and they were horrified by the cancer aspect of it. By then it was too late. We were at the printer, and there was nothing much they could do about it.
Showing that a superhero could be felled by something that we deal with in ordinary life, it really created a connection between reader and artist in a way that I think, particularly immediately after the death of Captain Marvel, haunted the comics. And all of a sudden, these people were far more human. These people in tights were far more human.
Death is as much a story device as marketing tool. So, does death in comics have any meaning at all anymore?
You have a book that sales have flattened on, kill the character. It creates interest, it generates, you know, all kinds of ire, or you know, people are happy, they're sad about it, and there's discussion, and the book gets attention. But nobody dies in comics. They all come back.
Gosh, I remember when I was a kid, Marvel characters, when they died, they stayed dead. When I was a kid, Gwen Stacy, dead, stayed dead. Adam Warlock, dead, stayed dead. Captain Marvel, dead, stayed dead. And nowadays, the characters have been brought back so much that the impact of killing them.
The afterlife in all comics has a giant revolving door on it, so nobody's dead forever. As a matter of fact, the turnaround time is getting faster and faster, it seems like, between killing guys off and resurrecting them.
I think it's a bad thing when death has no consequence anymore. Death really should be the last card you play, and it should have a lot of weight.
Superheroes die and come back all the time. But among those grave-hopping heroes, there are stories that stay with us for the rest of our lives. Sometimes in comics, death is a character you cheer for, even though you know you shouldn't.
The only person who hasn't come back is Uncle Ben, Peter's Uncle Ben. He will come back as a flesh-eating zombie eventually, I'm sure, but that would be the end of comics. That would be nothing. There's no stories left to be told. We're done. They're closing up shop. Print media is over with. That's it.
I think it's a bad thing when death has no consequence.
Death as a career move in comics is a very good one.
I think we have cheapened death in comics down to the point of uselessness. It has no impact anymore.
Made purely on story. Now, what kind of stories can I tell afterwards? What kind of, you know, what will that death mean to the other characters? You know, Gwen Stacy was Peter's girlfriend, and Green Goblin killed her.
It becomes apparent when there's a huge reaction to the death of a girl that this guy had to go, because the fans would not have accepted that he slips away and you don't see him again for 3 or 4 months. I still maintain that half the things we did were without our choice, because the characters almost wrote their own history. A character
seen in fiction. So it goes without saying there's always the threat of death. And not just for the heroes, but also for everyone around them.
When we started the strip, I wanted Gwen Stacy to be the girl that Peter would end up marrying.
We were told that they would like to shake up the readers. So I said, if you really want to shake them up, kill off a major character.
When I read The Death of Gwen Stacy as a very young boy, I was like blown away, because I was like, no, that doesn't happen. What, Spider-Man's supposed to save her.
You know, our decisions made
between this divine, unknowable presence that some people imagine exists and the human world. And so, like Christ, when they die, they are very human in their death, but they also hold out the potential, because they're connected to the divine, of an afterlife.
Death is a part of life, and you're dying to analyze it as much as possible.
In my own book, I think everybody in Hellboy and in the BPRD has been dead at least once. So what I always say about my own stuff is, when characters die, they just become more interesting.
Comic book heroes lead some of the most dangerous lives ever. Like the mythological heroes of ancient times, comic book characters seem to walk the line between mortal and immortal. They're simple adventure characters, but at the same time, they can symbolize so much more.
Well, in a way, superheroes are demigods. They're Christ-like in the sense that they do live in this zone between humanity and God. They're sort of intermediary.